Hey, we are at the Lively and Grit Daily House. I'm Mac, and I'm a tech reporter with CNBC. I am joined by the co-founders of the Wall Street Skinny. I'm going to introduce them in just a minute. Today's session is about virtual economies and how you build and manage wealth in these crypto ecosystems. I'm going to pass it over to Jen to kick us off.
Hi, guys. So again, I'm Jen Saarbach, and this is my co-founder here, Kristen Kelly. We've been lifelong friends. We've been friends since the second grade. And the purpose of our podcast is to basically democratize access to and demystify the financial services industry. So basically, we answer and ask all the questions that you're too afraid to ask about Wall Street, but that you've always wondered and always wanted to know. We very much have like childlike curiosity, and that curiosity extends to the world of digital currencies. We are by no means experts or practitioners in the space, but it touches every element of the financial services industry right now, and it's creating new pathways towards wealth creation and for careers for young people. So it's something that's super topical. We're really excited to speak about it.
Yeah. And so, Kristen, Jen, between the two of you, you've worked at Morgan Stanley, Barclays, Lehman, and then you moved from traditional Wall Street finance into this world of kind of demystifying it, as you said, both for seasoned experts and for people who are new to the space. Kristen, any other bio you want to add on there before we jump into the conversation?
No, I was just going to say that we basically, after we both left Wall Street, I went and I was essentially training people who wanted to start a career on Wall Street. And, we would go to business schools. We would basically teach at these institutions. But the thing is that, working on Wall Street for many people is a path to creating a tremendous amount of wealth. And unfortunately, as things are, I feel like especially in the more high finance world, everything is so structured. So if you don't know as a sophomore that you want to do it, you're kind of you've really handicapped yourself. It's really hard to get in. And so it was really important to us that we leverage, basically go to the places where younger people are. So through podcasts, through social media, and we try to make this information accessible. We have and fun. But we have enough knowledge of this sort of space to be dangerous. And so then we're able to then bring on experts and we're able to ask the questions that, like I said, that people don't want to ask because they're afraid to ask them. And we can ask them because we're not trying to impress anybody and get a job in Wall Street anymore. So.
And I feel like the question that everybody has, this has been a record-breaking week for crypto. You saw Bitcoin hit 2 fresh all-time highs.
Right.
But also there was the altcoin surge. And this is, and I guess my question is, this happens every bull run where you see these alternative coins, see these huge run-ups because comparatively they are a bargain buy, versus your blue chip crypto coins. But is it different this time around? Because you've got institutional money that's here in a way that it wasn't before. So in terms of building wealth in a virtual economy, people are, some people think, is this the way to get in? Is it altcoins, or is it just peak bubble conditions and it's headed for a big crash like we saw in the ICO cycle and a couple times before?
I generally think that this is symptomatic of a rising tide floats all boats. Whether it be the legitimization of the entire space through now the SEC-approved ETFs, just being something that has said, okay, we're bringing institutional flows into this space in a way that we didn't see before in the retail-led run-up that was 2017 to 2021, right? So I definitely think that is legitimate, and I think from a relative value standpoint, it's not so much about whether you buy in now. I think everyone, generally speaking, from a portfolio allocation standpoint, wants to have some small allocation to crypto. As far as actually timing your entry into the market, whether
you can never do that with anything. I feel like it's rare to get the timing right for any asset class. You can. Unless you're at an all-time low. But again, you never know if it's the actual low or if it's going to keep going down.
Right, exactly. So whether it's an optimal spot for entry, I don't think is the question. I think the real question is that I think that there's alternative ways to build wealth in the space now, not only by allocating a portion of your portfolio to individual currencies, but making investments in kind of the layer 2 technologies and infrastructures that are going to support these currencies now being the platform for increased leverage, for increased trading activity in the space.
And I think that it's a conversation that keeps coming up with all the VCs who I'm talking to. They say that they have never seen deal pacing move this aggressively, especially with Bitcoin layer 2 companies. And when I say layer 2, I'm just talking about any sort of startup that's built on top of that base blockchain. So money is really entering the space in a way that it hasn't before. You talk about Ethereum. There's a major upgrade coming in 4 days from now that's going to cut transaction fees by 90%. So the kinds of things that you couldn't do before because it was cost prohibitive are now possible. So I think that's fascinating, this idea that like the investment opportunity or like building wealth in a virtual economy is really going to be in terms of L2 infrastructure investment. Talk to me more about that.
I think that that's one element of it. And I also think that as we think about access to the capital markets, right? Here we were, 6 weeks ago, everyone was forecasting 6 Fed eases over the course of this year. Now people are saying they might not go at all, right? And we've always been so reliant on central banks to be this source of monetary stimulus into the economy, right? People are constantly looking for new ways to raise capital and be creative and access the capital markets. And I think as this layer 2 infrastructure gets built, that's going to be potentially new pathways for startups like us, for people who are entering this economy, to play in a very, very different way that the private credit market is trying to support right now, right? All of the traditional institutional players are trying to get into new ways of lending and borrowing and things like that. And I think we're going to continue to see this space evolve, as I do think that more leverage and more activity and more derivatives make that space safer.
Kristen, why? Why does more leverage make that space safer?
I mean, I think you can always argue whether more leverage makes the system safer or less safe. I think you can kind of go either way. It's like we both lived through the whole great financial crisis.
Weren't you on who was on the Lehman floor?
Me. I was working in CDOs, which, like, for anybody who's not familiar, right, that's where you're basically, you not only have the leverage because you take like a mortgage and you package them all up and then you lever that up. It's already levered, but then you lever it again and then you lever it again, right? So there's just like tremendous amount of leverage. So I do think there are situations where like too much leverage is maybe not the great thing, but at the same time, I mean, it also, again, like leverage allows more people to be able to afford more things. And there is like benefits to it.
And there's diversification within the system. Yeah. And I said that really quickly. Diversification within the system. I can't get that sentence out. So you have fewer really concentrated risks, right? And so I think that that's an important thing. I mean, if we learned any lessons from the global financial crisis, again, I was sitting on the trading floor at Lehman Brothers when we went under. My dad called me. My dad is sitting in the audience. Called me at 10 p.m. on September 14th and said, you got to go to the Lehman Brothers. They're going to lock the door. And my entire net worth as a 23-year-old was tied up in 2 pairs of shoes I had under my desk. So I had to sprint over there. But the moral of the story is that I think people who are willing to take risks in times of volatility end up almost always being the winners in the long run. And I think we're seeing that for so many people who didn't get scared away during the crypto collapse, during what happened with FTX, all that stuff, and looked for new opportunities, hand in hand with thinking about this from a more regulated, more stabilized way. I think that that's going a long way towards building more kind of security in the system, if you will. Yeah,
I mean, the erosion of trust that happened both in terms of the FTX collapse, but then also Binance just settled with the government for $4.3 billion. SEC was not a part of that settlement, so we'll see how that plays out. But I guess my question is more this building back trust and confidence in the ecosystem. How is that going?
Well, I think one of the things that's interesting is that since this move is not retail-led, the faith that people have in the existing institutions, I think, helps lend legitimacy to the entire move.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, like, you look at when this Bitcoin price run up started, it was when BlackRock put in its application for a spot Bitcoin ETF. Let's talk about how careers are changing. Like, you come from these traditional world, the traditional world of Wall Street and finance, and some people say these sales and trading jobs are going away, or they're not as vital as they used to be in this increased digitization of assets that historically needed a lot of subject matter expertise. Walk me through how the job ecosystem is evolving.
Well, I think, I mean, one thing that we are noticing is, I think especially for young people, it's just such an amazing opportunity because so when we started our account, we had this guy, his name is Crypto Trader 321, and he reached out, and come to find out, he's like 23, 24, maybe a younger, I don't know. He just graduated college. He is getting called up by Bloomberg all the time to like quote, like literally there was an article on the Bloomberg or on the Bitcoin run up, and he's quoted as talking about kind of what's going on. And he's constantly, asked about that. And he was saying like he went to, again, a great school. He went to Georgia Tech, but he had like a 2.8. Anyway, long story, but he was able to get in, and now is again like considered like an expert in the space because it is sort of a newer, it's starting to get more mature. It's starting to get more legitimized on Wall Street. But for someone who is starting a career, I think it's just like, again, there's so many amazing opportunities. I feel like Jen is she actually worked in sales and trading. So she's kind of has her finger on the pulse of kind of how things are changing in terms of the traditional.
Yeah, I can speak to that. So, I mean, when I started my role in 2006, right, so many things were still manual. If you wanted to get a trade executed, you actually needed to like stand up and shout across the trading row at someone. Now that is no longer the case. So there's just fewer warm bodies needed in that system. So there's a compression in terms of how much talent is required, but also it's so competitive to break in. So it's becoming increasingly challenging for young people to really build a footprint for their career coming up through that line of business, right? The reality is there's no college major that prepares you for a role on Wall Street or in finance in general. You can be a comp sci major, you can be a finance major, whatever. You're not going to know anything that you need to know day one on that desk until you get there.
Jen was an English major and I was an engineering major. So like we had no background in finance, but it's the type of thing where they expect that you're going to come into the job. They're going to train you in everything you need to know. Most of what you learn is it's like the apprenticeship model.
Right.
So you're learning most of what you need to know on the desk.
But in the digital currency world, even less so, right? Again, having a programming or coding background might help you, but there are fewer barriers to entry because you don't have to break through all the nonsense of these elite institutions with these specific recruiting programs at target schools and things like that. And so I think that it's actually become a great source of opportunity for young people who maybe want a career in the financial services space, but don't want to go through those traditional means to break in to a much flatter bench and be able to distinguish themselves much faster in their career, because all of this stuff is learned now in real time. Again, whether you go to Harvard or whether you go to some college that no one's ever heard of, none of them are going to have a cryptocurrency major, at least not yet.
Yeah, maybe they're starting to, but...
And did you say like you onboarded into crypto by watching a Netflix documentary, Cryptopia?
That's how I learned about the blockchain, was by watching a 2020 documentary on Netflix when I was locked up in my house during the pandemic. And I was like, well, I might as well learn
Matt
this.
Levine's like 40-page essay.
Yes, that too. And we read, we recently did an episode where we spotlighted Michael Lewis's book, Going Infinite, about the rise and fall of FTX. Honestly, the most interesting parts of that were how someone from the traditional financial services background, if you will, right? Not that like Jane Street is such a traditional firm. It's a high frequency trading firm. But how that gave rise to someone who then said, hey, listen, I'm going to take all these risks in the digital currency and exchange world, and then brought down the system single-handedly almost. I think that it's really interesting to see the intersection of the two. And as faith is restored into these institutions now through partnership with the old school elite institutions on Wall Street, how that in turn is creating a new generation of people coming up that don't necessarily have to go through the same kind of pedigree that we did.
And I think it's also just, it's not as competitive yet. Like a lot of people who are coming up, people are so laser focused right now. I mean, we see this all the time on private equity. Like that's what it's, every single person wants to do private equity. So go into investment banking. And so for someone who's like, well, I'm going to not go with the herd. I'm going to try to, and eventually I do think it's going to be something where it's like everyone is stampeding towards something in crypto and all that kind of fun stuff. But right now it's not. And so I do think, again, it's like you're able to kind of get in on the ground floor, or not the ground floor, but you're able to get in and ultimately kind of, as this starts to become a bigger and bigger thing and more almost like legitimized, like it's you're riding the wave up.
You know, one quarter of crypto that I find especially interesting are the U.S. dollar-pegged stablecoins. And, you know, we were chatting before this about the fact that, you know, in the early 2000s, microfinance was like the sexy thing to talk about. And in many ways, it's just been this failed experiment.
Yes.
And like, do these stablecoins revitalize that hypothesis, that thesis statement?
I want it to, right? Like, I really want it to. And I think that's kind of like the noble mission of digital currencies, right? Is, again, increased access to the digital to the capital markets for people who otherwise don't have it, or people in countries or communities that don't have access to those traditional lending paths. And then there's also kind of does this hold value, right? Like, can you create wealth generation too for, right, that like conventional belief in that? I really hope so, but I also think it's tough to navigate the, well, unfortunately reported on history of these digital currencies being the means through which more nefarious operations have funded themselves.
And the one thing I will say about stable coins is that, a lot of my reporting focuses on emerging markets, so places where local currencies are spiraling, and so it's not really a safe store of value. Sometimes you can't even get access to currencies. Definitely not U.S. dollar exposure, and that's where stable coins have been a game changer with respect to both creating wealth and storing wealth. Kristen, any thoughts on either that corner of it, the stable coins in emerging markets, or even like the rival between these CBDCs, these central bank issued currencies versus like a US dollar peg stable coin?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think that, I don't know. I mean, Jen, what are you? I'm actually not sure.
Everybody's
That's one of
reaction,
those things
though,
where I'm
because-
like, I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
no, I think
the reaction is, huh?
Yeah, and I think that a lot of people are skeptical about having a central bank issue these kinds of virtual coins. It seems to kind of go so far from the thesis statement of crypto, which is decentralized money that's outside the reach of central banks and governments, and so.
Well, that's exactly right. Like, are you a crypto purist, right? And I think that so many people entering the market right now are not. And if you were a crypto purist, your thesis has been borne out, right? What is it? Like, hodl, right? Like the misspelling of hold, right? Like we had a joke on our podcast that it's kind of like from Fight Club, right? Like in any asset class on a long enough time horizon, right? Just like they said, like on a long enough time horizon, everyone's survival rate drops to zero. You hold any asset class long enough, eventually you'll make money. Like you'll be dead, but like you'll be rich. But I think the purists are now using the recent run up as proof of concept, right? And I think that there is very much something to that. The question is what does it mean for like the wholesale future of central banks and currencies? Is it really going to shift? I don't necessarily think so, just after what we saw, especially in the early 2000s with that case study of microfinance, like you said.
And this idea of like purists having a different view of what the future world of crypto looks like. I mean, I've talked to a lot of Bitcoiners. Austin is very much Bitcoin country, and they think of it as a closed ecosystem. So it's not about like off-ramping your cash to fiat and cashing out on these huge returns.
Right.
It's like truly about existing in a Bitcoin economy where you pay in sats and you use the Lightning Network, which is that layer 2 payment network.
Well, that's exactly right. I think at least there's just too much money and there's too many interests tied to the status quo in order for that to really take hold and happen. I think there's still going to be those, I don't want to call them fringe communities, but it's hard to see that really being mainstreamed, at least until technology takes another big leap forward. I just don't think the technology's there.
I feel like you guys have your finger to the pulse of what people want to know about crypto, like what the questions are, because you're trying to answer those questions through your series. And so, I mean, talk to me about what keeps you up at night when you think about crypto, what people want to know. Like, give me some insight into what
I'll be very honest. I think that the average person hears about crypto all the time and is still like, okay, so the blockchain, so you've got the transactions and then they can't be rerouted. I really do think that so many people still struggle with the basic fundamentals of it and are afraid to ask those questions because everyone's sounding so knowledgeable about what's going on in crypto and it's making all these headlines and they're like, hey, I still don't really understand the basics. So what keeps me up at night is like the regulations are being written in these realms by people who are not only not experts and not practitioners, but like don't understand the basic fundamentals of how these things work and are too afraid to ask. So my concern is that the laws and the rules and the regulations are in the same way that we saw this, I think, in writ large in the conventional financial services industry, are being written by people who don't actually understand how the stuff works.
Mm-hmm. I was going to say, I mean, I think most people like have read about it, can have like a conversation about it. Also, though, like if you ask them like a detail about it, it's like it all falls down. Right? Like it's like it's
you
a
pull
house
out
of
one
cards.
thread.
You pull out one thread and it all falls down. And it is interesting how, I mean, we had this conversation like back when we were interviewing this again crypto trader. when we found out his name, we were like, we've discovered who Batman is. But when he's like throwing out all these like ICO, and at the time like we were getting up the learning curve on all these things. I mean, the jargon, it was like every 5 seconds it would be like, wait a second, what does that mean? What does that mean? And it almost for us was a reminder, right? Because we're talking about everything in finance all the time. It's like EBITDA, market cap, blah, 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 all these things, right? And it's one of those things where it's like, oh, wow, like it becomes this language that walls other people off, right? It becomes very inaccessible to someone who doesn't have that vocabulary. And I do think that for people who, especially when you're older, young people are like a sponge. They learn things so quickly, so fast. It's incredible. And so for people who are a little bit older, right, it's hard to teach them because there's just this whole language that they're not speaking yet. And it's really hard to ask questions when you really don't understand the fundamental basics of like, what is this used for, and everything that goes along with it. So to Jen's point, during the financial crisis, it's like we saw what happened with, again, the CDO thing. I think I'm one of the few people that understands how a CDO works because I literally worked on the desk that was originating him for a few months, and then everyone got fired, and then I moved. But it was one of those things where no one understood what the heck was going on. And it's the same. I do think there's a lot of that with crypto as well. I mean,
yeah. Jen, Kristen, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you also to Lively and Grit Daily House for hosting this conversation, and to everyone who's here with us today. I will pass it back to the MC.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.